The thunderous pounding on my front door shook the entire house. Then, with a violent crash, it was kicked open. 3 men, clad in official HOA uniforms, stormed inside, barking, "You're in violation. We have authorization to inspect." I stood frozen, disbelief clawing at me. A search warrant from a homeowners association? Where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below because this story is about to grip you tight. You see, you don't mess with a gang of old bikers who know their legal rights, especially not when one of them is a retired attorney with 35 years of courtroom battles under his belt. That's me, Jake Thompson. Retirement was supposed to be peaceful after decades of fighting criminal cases across 3 states. I thought I'd earned a quiet life. Last spring, I bought a modest house in Sunrise Estates, a neighborhood that seemed perfect. Quiet streets, reasonable prices, and just enough garage space for my prized Harley-Davidson and the occasional gathering with my riding friends. The realtor mentioned something about an HOA, but I shrugged it off. They just make sure nobody paints their house neon green or lets their grass grow wild, she joked. I signed the papers. Biggest mistake of my life. We call ourselves the Silver Wolves, a tight-knit group of 8 retired professionals in their 50s and 60s, bound by a passion for motorcycles and weekend barbecues. Bill was a former state Supreme Court judge. Frank had been CFO at a Fortune 500 company. Alex was an ex-FBI cybersecurity specialist. Each of us carried impressive stories and skills. Our weekends were simple. Working on bikes in my garage, grilling steaks, swapping stories from the past. Nothing illegal, nothing wild, just old friends savoring their golden years. But Gerald Montgomery, the HOA president, had other plans. This former middle manager, downsized 5 years ago, had turned Sunrise Estates into his personal kingdom. His weapon? An ever-expanding rulebook designed to control every inch of our lives. My first run-in with him came 3 weeks after moving in. He showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, face set in a permanent scowl. "Mr. Thompson," he said without so much as a greeting, "I'm noting multiple violations of our community standards." The list was absurd. My garage door wasn't the exact approved shade of beige. My mailbox didn't match the HOA-approved design. My trash can stayed on the curb too long after collection, noon instead of right after the garbage truck. I tried to be reasonable at first, repainted the door, swapped out the mailbox, hid those damn trash cans quicker than evidence disappearing in a crooked cop's case. But the violations kept coming. Hedges 2 inches too tall. A bird feeder attracting nuisance wildlife. My Harley was deemed an eyesore and ordered to be hidden inside at all times. Each violation came with a fine, and the fines kept growing. "This is ridiculous," I told Bill one Saturday while working on his Softail. Montgomery had dropped another notice the day before. Apparently, having friends over more than twice a month was now a commercial establishment. Bill chuckled, but his eyes held worry. "Jake, I've seen HOAs go rogue. They start with little things. If nobody pushes back, they bleed you dry or force you out." That night, as we enjoyed a perfectly legal barbecue, 3 men in polo shirts with HOA enforcement stitched on the pockets showed up at my fence. No introductions. Just cameras flashing and notes scribbled. "Excuse me," I called out. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The tallest, a balding man with a mustache that looked straight out of a 1970s cop show, barely glanced up. "Documenting an unauthorized gathering. HOA limits residential parties to 6 people without prior approval." I looked around at my 7 friends and smiled. "You know who we are, just a bunch of old guys who love motorcycles." That casual remark lit a fuse that would ignite a war shaking the entire neighborhood. What Montgomery didn't realize was that sitting quietly among us was a former state Supreme Court judge, calmly sipping his beer and mentally cataloging every illegal move these HOA enforcers made. After that, the notices poured in every week. Motorcycle parked longer than 3 hours? Violation. Window curtains not in the approved color palette? Violation. Unauthorized wind chimes causing a noise disturbance? Violation. Each infraction brought a fine starting at $50 but rapidly snowballing. Within a month, I owed over $1,200 in HOA fines. I tried attending the monthly HOA meetings to dispute these charges, only to find a new rule that barred residents with outstanding violations from participating. They could observe silently, but not speak. One morning, while collecting my mail, I spotted an elderly woman across the street, sitting on her porch, trembling as she stared at a letter. Martha Wilson, a widow who had lived in Sunrise Estates for nearly 30 years, long before the HOA existed. I crossed over. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Tears welled in her eyes. "They're going to take my home," she whispered. "The HOA fees have tripled in 2 years. Now, with all these fines, I'm on a fixed income. I can't keep up." She couldn't finish the sentence. I sat beside her, reading the letter. The HOA threatened to place a lien on her house for unpaid fees and fines totaling nearly $5,000. The reasons? Laughable. Holiday decorations displayed outside approved seasons. Unauthorized garden plants. Failure to power wash her driveway quarterly. Martha had called this place home for 3 decades. Now it was at risk because her daffodils weren't on the HOA's approved list. That night, I convened an emergency meeting of the Silver Wolves in my garage. "This isn't just about us anymore," I told them, holding up Martha's letter. "Montgomery and his enforcers are targeting the most vulnerable, especially long-time residents. They want to force people out." Alex, usually quiet, spoke up. "I'll dig into their finances. Every HOA has public records. If there's foul play, I'll find it." Frank nodded. "I'll help analyze anything Alex uncovers. If they're cooking the books, we'll expose it." Within a week, we had our first clues. HOA fees had soared 300% in 2 years, but community facilities showed no improvements. The reserve fund ballooned over $500,000 with little transparency on how it was spent. Alex hacked into their website backend and uncovered emails between Montgomery and several contractors, discussing consulting fees and secret projects never disclosed to residents. Just as I was reviewing these explosive findings, a certified letter arrived. Before I even opened the letter, I knew the news would be bad. The HOA was fining me $5,000 for operating a commercial enterprise for my residents. That meant my weekend gatherings with the Silver Wolves were suddenly illegal. The letter included an ultimatum: pay within 30 days, relocate, or face enforcement action. I held the letter, my hand shaking with rage. Bill took one look at my face and nodded. "It's time, Jake. I think we need to activate Operation Paper Trail you've been talking about." What happened next would shock not just Montgomery, but the entire neighborhood. But before I tell you about our plan, let me share what really set me off. I dealt with all kinds of criminals during my career as an attorney: murderers, drug lords, corrupt politicians, but none made my blood boil like Gerald Montgomery and his HOA goons. For 2 months, I tried to play by their rules, tried to be reasonable, but they kept moving the goalposts. The $5,000 fine was the last straw. What they did next crossed every legal and moral line imaginable. On Alex's advice, I had installed security cameras around my property. Nothing fancy, just enough to document any further harassment. Good thing I did. One Tuesday afternoon, while volunteering at the local veteran center, another thing Montgomery had tried to prevent, claiming my comings and goings disrupted the community ambience, my phone buzzed with a security alert. The footage showed 3 HOA enforcement officers picking the lock on my front door and entering my house. They were inside for nearly 20 minutes, rifling through my personal belongings, taking photos, and removing items from my garage. I called the police immediately and raced home. Officer Ramirez was waiting when I arrived, looking uncomfortable as he spoke with the 3 men who were still in my garage. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "these gentlemen say they have authorization to inspect properties for HOA violations. They're showing me a clause in the HOA agreement allowing inspections in cases of suspected serious violations." I pushed past him into my garage and felt my heart sink. My tools were scattered everywhere, and there was a fresh scratch along the fuel tank of my Harley. They'd damaged my property and stolen personal items. I told Ramirez, "That's breaking and entering, destruction of property, and theft. I want them arrested." The head goon, later identified as Decker, smirked and held up a piece of paper. "We have authorization right here." Section 12, Paragraph 3 of the HOA Covenant. The association reserves the right to inspect properties in emergencies. Your continued operation of an illegal business constitutes an emergency. Ramirez looked torn, clearly unsure about the legality. Sir, this seems to be a civil matter regarding HOA agreement interpretation. I suggest consulting an attorney. I had to laugh. I'd been an attorney for 35 years, specializing in criminal law. I told him, no HOA agreement trumps state law about breaking and entering. No private organization can enter a residence without permission or a court order. Period. Ramirez looked even more uncomfortable, especially when I added, and I'll file a formal complaint against the department if these men aren't at least detained while you investigate the break-in, which is clearly on my security cameras. That evening, my daughter Susan arrived from the city. She was a practicing attorney herself and furious after reviewing the HOA agreement. Dad, this is textbook overreach, she said. Those emergency inspection clauses are for actual emergencies, like water leaks that could damage properties, not for enforcing arbitrary rules on social gatherings. And removing items from your home? That's theft, plain and simple. I called an emergency meeting of the Silver Wolves that night. All 8 of us gathered in my living room, the mood somber but determined. They crossed the line. I told them, this isn't about petty rules anymore. They're breaking the law and targeting vulnerable residents. It's time we show Montgomery who he's messing with. Frank, our financial expert, shook his head. I've been analyzing their financial reports. There are huge discrepancies. Money funneled into consulting companies with no record. Potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Bill, the former judge, had been quietly listening. Now he spoke up. I think it's time to activate Operation Paper Trail. I'll call some old friends at the state court. 8 old men with over 400 years of combined experience in law, finance, technology, and security started planning that night. Little did we know our revenge plan would uncover something far bigger than we anticipated. I've never been a man who backs down from a fight, especially when I know I'm right. After 35 years battling prosecutors, corrupt cops, and corporate lawyers, I developed a sixth sense for when someone is hiding something, and every instinct told me Montgomery was sitting on a mountain of secrets. Operation Paper Trail began the next morning at my kitchen table. 8 aging professionals huddled over coffee mugs like we were planning a heist, and in a way, we were. We planned to steal back the truth Montgomery had buried under years of paperwork and intimidation. We divided into teams, each using our expertise to dig into different HOA operations. Frank and I started with finances, requesting copies of all HOA financial statements for the past 5 years, a right guaranteed to all members under state law. Montgomery tried to block us, claiming the records were under audit. But a firmly worded letter from Susan, citing specific state statutes, changed his tune quickly. What we found was astounding. HOA fees had tripled while actual community maintenance expenditures decreased. The reserve fund had ballooned to over $700,000, far more than any reasonable contingency for a neighborhood our size. The most suspicious were payments to consulting companies, Summit Property Management, Elite Community Services, and Paramount Maintenance Solutions, each receiving between $10,000 and $30,000 monthly for vaguely described community enhancement consulting and regulatory compliance management. Classic corporate jargon, meaningless but perfect to disguise fraud. I recognized the pattern immediately. The shell game of moving money between entities to obscure its true destination. Meanwhile, Alex was working his tech magic. These companies don't really exist, he announced after 2 days of digging. They have websites and business filings, but all registered to the same P.O. box. And guess who signed as the incorporating officer for all 3? Margaret Montgomery, Gerald's wife. The web was tighter than we imagined. This was no coincidence. It was a family operation disguised in corporate smoke and mirrors, siphoning money from the HOA coffers into their personal accounts. Bill reached out discreetly to county officials. Within 48 hours, we had copies of documents revealing numerous complaints about financial misconduct linked to the Montgomerys, but nothing had been acted upon. Local authorities had either been slow or turning a blind eye. Meanwhile, Alex uncovered more digital breadcrumbs, emails between Gerald and these shell companies discussing hefty consulting fees that coincided suspiciously with sudden fee hikes. It was all too clear. The HOA was being exploited as a cash cow for the Montgomery family's personal gain. That evening, during a community meeting, Bill confronted Montgomery publicly with our findings. The room, once filled with fearful neighbors, buzzed with anger and disbelief. Residents who had suffered in silence began speaking out, sharing stories eerily similar to ours. Montgomery tried to deflect, claiming these were standard operational expenses and our claims were baseless. But the evidence was damning. The pressure mounted, and whispers of legal action spread through Sunrise Estates like wildfire. We had turned the tables. The hunters had become the hunted. But the Montgomerys weren't ready to quit. The following week, a cease and desist letter arrived for each of us, accusing us of defamation and threatening lawsuits if we didn't back down. Typical bully tactics. But with Bill's experience and Susan's legal firepower, we were ready. Our next move? To take this battle from the neighborhood HOA meetings to the courtroom, where I'd spent 35 years mastering the law and where justice had the final say. The war for Sunrise Estates was just beginning. I snatched the paper and scanned it quickly. The warrant looked official at first glance, but the fine print told a different story. It was signed by someone I'd never heard of, dated just the day before, and authorized solely by the HOA itself. No court approval, no judge's signature, just a rubber stamp from Montgomery's cronies. This isn't legal, I said firmly. You can't break into someone's home and confiscate their property without a proper court order. Decker shrugged, his smug smile never faltering. It's a civil matter, Mr. Thompson. You owe money. We're collecting. I pulled out my phone. I'm recording this. If you don't leave right now, I'll call the police. He hesitated, weighing his options, then gave a curt nod. You're making things harder for yourself, Thompson. They dropped the TV awkwardly, muttering under their breath, and stomped out, slamming the door behind them. I locked it up tight and sat down, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't petty harassment anymore. This was a declaration of war. That night, armed with Karen Evans' key and the knowledge that the security cameras would be off, I returned to the HOA office. The building was dark and silent. I slipped inside quietly, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The filing cabinet stood where Karen said it would, and inside the folder marked Special Projects were the documents we needed: financial statements, shady contracts, invoices for fictitious repairs, and emails between Montgomery and Sunrise Heights LLC. The evidence was damning. Montgomery wasn't just exploiting his position. He was orchestrating a scheme to siphon money from the HOA while pushing vulnerable homeowners out so developers could snap up their properties at a discount. He was playing both sides, profiting off the destruction of the community he was supposed to protect. I copied everything onto a flash drive, my hands shaking slightly as I locked the cabinet and slipped out. The silence of the neighborhood outside felt heavier, as if the shadows themselves were watching. Over the next few days, the Silver Wolves sprang into action. Each of us distributed copies of the evidence to residents, community leaders, and the local press. The stories poured in: elderly widows threatened with foreclosure, families blindsided by sudden assessments, longtime owners locked out of neighborhood meetings. Detective Collins reviewed the documents and, after some cautious negotiation with his superiors, agreed to open an official investigation. The political connections Montgomery wielded were strong, but the evidence was overwhelming. Montgomery's empire began to crack. Faced with mounting public outrage, legal pressure, and the united front of the community, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Montgomery was confronted with the facts: the embezzlement, the fraud, the elder abuse. He tried to deny it at first, then growled and finally crumbled under the weight of his own lies. In the end, justice was slow but certain. Montgomery resigned, his shell companies were dismantled, and a new, transparent HOA board was elected. Many families were able to reclaim their homes and rebuild their lives. The Silver Wolves rode through the neighborhood once more, not as rebels, but as guardians, a reminder that even the smallest communities could stand up to corruption when people refused to back down. And I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning of our fight for fairness. From his hand, my legal training immediately spotted the problem. This wasn't a court-issued warrant. It was a homemade document with the HOA logo, signed by Montgomery himself. "This isn't a legal warrant," I said, my voice deadly calm. "This is a piece of paper that gives you absolutely no authority to enter my home or take my property. What you're doing is breaking and entering and theft. Put my television down now, or I'm calling the police and having all three of you arrested." Decker hesitated, then nodded to his companions to continue. "We have authorization from the HOA board. Your complaints have been noted and rejected." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, maintaining eye contact with Decker the entire time. "I need police at 1340 Sunrise Drive immediately. 3 men have broken into my home and are removing my property. I am a homeowner, and these men have no legal authority to be here. Please hurry, I don't know if they're armed." Decker's face paled slightly at the mention of weapons. I hadn't accused them of being armed, but the suggestion was enough to make the 911 dispatcher classify this as a priority call. While we waited for the police, I texted the Silver Wolves our emergency code red alert at base. Within 20 minutes, all 7 of my friends had arrived, each parking their Harleys in a semicircle around the driveway, effectively blocking the HOA goons' vehicles. By the time Officer Ramirez arrived, he was faced with 3 increasingly nervous HOA enforcement officers surrounded by 8 grim-faced older men, a group that included a former judge, a retired FBI agent, and several other highly respected professionals. This time, Ramirez couldn't dismiss the situation as a civil matter. With multiple witnesses, clear evidence of forced entry, and the ridiculous fake warrant, he had no choice but to take statements and document the break-in. He stopped short of arresting Decker and his companions, but warned them that a formal investigation would follow. As they slunk away, I looked at Montgomery's right-hand man and said quietly, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Montgomery needed to understand what he was up against. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my living room, the splintered door frame a constant reminder of the violation I'd experienced. In my years as an attorney, I'd represented people who'd had their homes invaded. I'd seen the lasting trauma such violations caused, the feeling that your personal space was no longer secure. Now, experiencing it firsthand, it fueled a determination in me that I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about petty rules anymore. This was about standing up against tyranny in its most local form, the kind that creeps in through neighborhood regulations and flowers into full-blown corruption when left unchecked. As dawn broke, I stood in my garage, running my hand along the scratch on my Harley's fuel tank. I bought this bike the day I retired, a promise to myself that after decades of suits and courtrooms, I would finally enjoy the freedom of the open road. Now, some power-hungry bureaucrat and his goons thought they could take that away from me, take away my home, my peace of mind, my dignity. I started the Harley, letting its rumble fill the garage. The vibration traveled up through my hands, steady and powerful like a heartbeat. This bike represented everything Montgomery was trying to destroy: independence, freedom, the right to live your life without petty interference. I made a decision then. Montgomery wouldn't just be stopped, he would be made an example of. The next morning, we launched Phase 2 of our plan. Rick, our former journalist, contacted Dana Howard, an investigative reporter for the local newspaper. Bill reached out to Councilman Rodriguez, who had been advocating for stricter oversight of HOAs. Alex created a website and Facebook page called Sunrise Estates Truth, where we began posting documentation of the HOA's financial irregularities and abuses of power. Meanwhile, I worked with Susan to prepare a class action lawsuit on behalf of the residents who had been victimized. Karen proved to be an invaluable ally. Using the keys she had provided, Bill and I entered the HOA office on Sunday evening, while she ensured the security cameras were disabled. In Montgomery's filing cabinet, we found the mother lode: detailed plans for Sunrise Heights luxury condos, a development that would replace the entire neighborhood. The documents included projections of properties likely to be acquired through foreclosure or stress sales due to HOA pressure, with timeline targets for each acquisition. Most disturbing were the notes about specific residents, including Martha Wilson, categorized as priority targets due to their limited financial resources and inability to fight back legally. With this evidence in hand, we were ready for our most public move yet. On Wednesday morning, 30 motorcycles, the Silver Wolves had called in reinforcements from veteran friends, formed a line outside the HOA office. None of us got off our bikes. We simply sat there, engines idling, creating a wall of chrome and leather that couldn't be ignored. Local news vans arrived, tipped off by Dana Howard. Residents gathered, curious about the spectacle. When Montgomery finally emerged from the office, visibly shaken, I rode forward and used a bullhorn to address the crowd and cameras. My name is Jake Thompson. I've lived in Sunrise Estates for less than a year, but I've experienced more harassment and illegal behavior from our HOA than I saw in 35 years as a criminal attorney. My friends and I have uncovered evidence that Gerald Montgomery has been using the HOA to systematically target elderly and vulnerable residents, imposing crippling fines and fees to force them out of their homes. Meanwhile, HOA funds have been funneled to shell companies controlled by Montgomery's family, and he's been working with developers to replace our neighborhood with luxury condos. I held up copies of the documents we'd found. We have the evidence right here. Financial records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars diverted to fake companies, plans targeting specific elderly residents for foreclosure, development proposals that would destroy the homes many of you have lived in for decades. This stops today. We demand Montgomery's immediate resignation, a full financial audit of the HOA, and new elections supervised by independent observers. The crowd's reaction was electric. Residents who had suffered in silence, afraid to challenge the HOA's authority, suddenly found their voices. They shared stories of arbitrary fines, denied improvement requests, and threatening letters. Montgomery attempted to retreat into the office, but the crowd blocked his path, demanding answers. What I didn't know was that Montgomery had already called Captain Bennett, the head of our local police precinct and, as we would later learn, a significant investor in Sunrise Heights LLC. Montgomery shouted over the crowd, "You have 24 hours to retract these slanderous accusations and pay your outstanding fines, or you'll face the consequences. This neighborhood needs order and rules, not anarchy led by a gang of troublemakers." Just then, 3 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, led by Captain Bennett himself. The captain strode directly to Montgomery's side, not even pretending to assess the situation impartially. "This gathering is unlawful," he announced through his own bullhorn. "Disperse immediately or face arrest for disturbing the peace." I wasn't intimidated. "Captain Bennett," I responded, still using my bullhorn, "this is a peaceful demonstration on public property. We have evidence of serious financial crimes being committed by the HOA under Mr. Montgomery's leadership. As a law enforcement officer, I would think you'd be more interested in investigating those allegations than in shutting down citizens exercising their constitutional rights." Bennett's face hardened. "Final warning, Thompson. Disperse now." I nodded to the Silver Wolves, and we started our engines in unison, creating a wall of sound that drowned out anything else Bennett might have said. Then, in perfect formation, we rode away. But we weren't retreating. We were just moving the battlefield. Captain Bennett might have dispersed our demonstration, but he couldn't stop what came next. That evening, Dana Howard's exposé ran on the front page of the local newspaper. HOA corruption alleged. Residents claim systematic targeting of elderly homeowners. The article detailed our findings, including financial documents showing the flow of money to Montgomery's shell companies. By morning, local TV stations had picked up the story, and state-level officials were beginning to ask questions. Montgomery called an emergency press conference, attempting to paint the Silver Wolves as a motorcycle gang trying to take over the neighborhood. "These men are upset because they can't follow simple community rules," he told the cameras. "They're using intimidation tactics against volunteers who are just trying to maintain property values and community standards." He looked directly into the camera. Mr. Thompson and his gang need to understand that their behavior will not be tolerated. The HOA will be pursuing all legal avenues, including criminal charges for harassment and defamation. Behind the scenes, Montgomery was panicking. Karen informed us that he had been shredding documents all morning and making frantic calls to his contacts. Captain Bennett had stationed officers outside the HOA office, supposedly for security, but effectively blocking residents from entering to ask questions. Montgomery's lawyer sent cease and desist letters to the newspaper and TV stations, threatening lawsuits if they continued reporting on the allegations. But the Silver Wolves had anticipated this reaction. We were ready for our final move. Susan filed our class action lawsuit representing 70% of Sunrise Estates residents, alleging fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and civil rights violations. Frank prepared a detailed financial analysis showing that at least $2 million had been diverted from HOA funds to Montgomery shell companies over the past 3 years. Alex had documented every email between Montgomery and the developers, proving his role in targeting vulnerable residents. And I personally delivered our complete findings to District Attorney Phillips, bypassing Captain Bennett entirely. The pressure became too intense for even Montgomery's connections to withstand. The State Attorney General's office announced an investigation into the HOA's financial practices. The county recorder began reviewing all property transfers associated with Sunrise Heights LLC. Captain Bennett was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into his relationship with Montgomery and the developers. 3 weeks after our motorcycle demonstration, Montgomery, his wife, and 2 board members were indicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. The investigation expanded beyond our neighborhood, uncovering a pattern of similar schemes in other communities. Captain Bennett faced charges of his own for accepting bribes to ignore complaints about the HOA and for using his position to intimidate residents. As Montgomery was led away from his arraignment, he locked eyes with me. "You think you've won, Thompson. You have no idea who our friends are. This isn't over." I might have dismissed his threat as empty bluster, but the look in his eyes gave me pause, and as it turned out, he wasn't entirely bluffing. Montgomery was released on bail within hours, thanks to his connections. The very next day, residents throughout Sunrise Estates received certified letters from Pinnacle Legal Associates, representing Sunrise Heights Development Corporation. The letters announced that the corporation had purchased all outstanding HOA debts and liens and would be proceeding with foreclosure actions against any properties with unpaid assessments, which, thanks to Montgomery's manipulations, included nearly half the neighborhood. It was a clever move. Even if Montgomery went to jail, the development plan could proceed under the guise of legitimate debt collection. Many residents panicked, afraid that they would lose their homes. Despite our recent victories, the Silver Wolves called an emergency meeting at my house to address this new threat. Susan reviewed the letters carefully and spotted the critical weakness. "All these debt transfers are based on HOA fines and fees that were illegally imposed," she explained. "If the original debt isn't valid, then the transfer of that debt isn't valid either." Bill nodded in agreement. "We need to file for an emergency injunction to halt any foreclosure proceedings while the criminal cases are pending." But we needed more than legal maneuvering. We needed to expose the entire network. Dana Howard's follow-up investigation provided the missing piece. After digging into Pinnacle Legal Associates and Sunrise Heights Development, she discovered that both were partially owned by a holding company connected to none other than Captain Bennett. The police captain hadn't just been taking bribes. He was a full partner in the development scheme, using his position to ensure complaints about the HOA were buried and that residents who resisted were intimidated. This revelation blew the case wide open. The State Attorney General expanded the investigation to include Bennett and several other city officials who had facilitated the scheme. Internal Affairs launched a separate investigation into the police department's handling of HOA complaints, uncovering a pattern of ignored reports and mishandled evidence. What had begun as a dispute over motorcycle gatherings and petty HOA violations had exposed a corruption network that extended throughout the city government. The final dominoes fell quickly. District Attorney Phillips, eager to distance himself from the scandal, pursued the cases aggressively. Montgomery and his wife accepted a plea deal, providing testimony against Bennett and the developers in exchange for reduced sentences. Bennett was indicted on multiple counts of corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy. Sunrise Heights Development Corporation was forced into bankruptcy, and all liens against Sunrise Estates properties were declared invalid. The HOA itself was completely restructured. A resident-elected board with term limits and strict transparency requirements replaced Montgomery's regime. Fees were reduced to their pre-Montgomery levels, and many of the most restrictive regulations were eliminated. Martha Wilson kept her home, and other elderly residents who had been forced out received compensation from the assets seized from Montgomery and his co-conspirators. As for me, I declined offers to serve on the new HOA board. I'd spent enough time fighting in courtrooms. I told my neighbors, now I just want to enjoy my retirement, my motorcycle, and my friends. The Silver Wolves became local celebrities of sorts, the old guys on Harleys who had taken down a corruption ring. We were even invited to serve on a city task force reviewing HOA regulations across the county to ensure what happened at Sunrise Estates couldn't happen elsewhere. 6 months after Montgomery's indictment, we held the biggest barbecue Sunrise Estates had ever seen. The entire neighborhood turned out, along with reporters, city officials, and even District Attorney Phillips, who was rumored to be considering a run for mayor. The Silver Wolves arrived in formation, our Harleys gleaming in the sun. As I looked around at my friends and neighbors, at Martha Wilson smiling on her porch, at families enjoying their homes without fear of arbitrary fines or harassment, I felt a deep satisfaction that no courtroom victory had ever provided. Martha approached me as I was flipping burgers. Her steps were steadier now, her eyes brighter than when I'd first met her trembling on her porch with that dreaded HOA letter. "You know, Jake," she said, handing me a cold beer, "I've lived in this house for 37 years. Raised my children here, buried my husband, and promised him I'd stay as long as I could. When Montgomery started with his notices, I thought I'd have to break that promise." She looked around at the neighbors laughing, children playing. "You and your friends gave me back my home. Gave all of us back our homes." Bill joined us, putting an arm around Martha's shoulders. "We just exposed the truth, Martha. The community did the rest." He nodded toward a group of younger residents who had spearheaded the formation of the new HOA board, transparent, accountable, and focused on actually serving the neighborhood rather than controlling it. "That's the thing about bullies," I said, watching a child race past on a bike with streamers flowing from the handlebars, the kind of neighborhood eyesore that would have resulted in a fine under Montgomery's regime. They only have power when people are afraid to stand up to them. Once one person stands up, it gives others courage. Later that evening, as the party wound down and the Silver Wolves gathered around a fire pit in my backyard, Frank raised his glass to me. To Jake, who couldn't mind his own business even in retirement. The others laughed and raised their glasses too. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. I didn't do anything special. I just refused to be bullied. Sometimes that's all it takes. Rick said it best. Alex, our tech expert who'd been quieter than usual all evening, finally spoke up. "You know what gets me? It's not just what Montgomery and his cronies did. It's that they thought they could get away with it, that no one would bother to look closely enough to connect the dots. People like Montgomery count on apathy," Bill said, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "They count on people being too busy, too intimidated, or too isolated to fight back. That's why community matters. That's why what happened here is about more than just an HOA." I looked around at my friends, these men who had stood with me, who had brought their lifetime of skills to bear on a problem that threatened not just me, but an entire neighborhood of people. We were all north of 60, with various aches and pains, gray hair, and reading glasses, but in this fight, we'd found a purpose that many of us had been missing since retirement. We hadn't just saved homes. We'd reminded ourselves and everyone around us that we still mattered, that our knowledge and experience could still make a difference. The next morning, as I sat on my porch drinking coffee, I watched the neighborhood come alive. People waved as they walked past. Children rode bikes on sidewalks that had once been off-limits. A couple was painting their front door a bright yellow that would have given Montgomery an aneurysm. Across the street, Martha was planting flowers, not from the approved list, but wildflowers in every color imaginable. Sometimes people who abuse their power forget one important thing: never underestimate old people. We don't just have time and experience, we have skills and connections built over lifetimes. And most importantly, we have little left to lose when we stand up for what's right. As Bill likes to say, justice may come slowly, but it always arrives. And sometimes, it arrives with a rumble of 30 Harleys outside your office door. When I look back now, I realize that what happened in Sunrise Estates wasn't just about defeating a corrupt HOA president. It was about reclaiming something more fundamental: the right of people to live with dignity in their own homes, to form genuine communities based on mutual respect rather than fear and control. It was about proving that even in retirement, we could still fight for what matters, that the silver wolves still had teeth. So, if you ever find yourself facing your own version of Gerald Montgomery, someone who thinks their petty power gives them the right to bully and intimidate, remember our story. Stand your ground. Find your allies. Dig for the truth. Because bullies like Montgomery are counting on your silence, on your isolation. And the one thing they can't withstand is people coming together, standing tall, and saying in one voice,
No.